Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation, From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. When the Angles and Saxons settled in ancient England, Britain it was then called, they at first maintained their military form of organisation, so that each settlement was a kind of camp. But as time went on and villages became permanent, a civil form of social order began slowly to evolve. The first step in this was the institution of the kin bond, where blood relatives stood together for support and protection, the individual and his family being mutually responsible. This gave way, in the course of time, to voluntary associations founded not on blood relationship, but on community ties, existing to protect the individual against the group, to preserve order in the settlement, and for a variety of similar purposes. These associations, described as artificial in contrast to the natural bond of blood, were the first guilds in England, in virtue of which fact it cannot be said that anybody ever discovered or invented guilds. They grew out of a natural condition in response to social necessity, just as they had come into existence among the Greeks and Romans centuries before, the former calling them thiasoi and the latter collegia. It is generally believed by the more dependable authorities that it is very possible that there may have been some historical continuity between the guilds of early England and the Roman collegia, but the historical remains of the period are too scanty to enable us to make sure on that point. If such continuity ever existed, it was more probably in Italy, where the collegia longest endured, and which, like most other European countries, had a guild system of its own. The word guild continues to be a puzzle as far as its etymology is concerned. The North Germans had Geld, meaning money, the Danish Gild, a religious feast in honour of the god Odin, the Anglo-Saxons Gild, from the same root as yield, and meaning a fixed payment of money, the Bretons Gui, a feast or holiday, the Welsh Gimlad, a festival. In later times, when guilds became everywhere common, the North Germans used the word guild, the South Germans Zunft, the French métier, and the Italians arte. In 16th century England, the word was generally superseded by company, corporation, or mystery, the last name derived from the Latin ministerium, or trade, and having no reference to anything mysterious, being preserved in our usage to this day as when we speak of the arts, parts, and mysteries of Freemasonry. The first guilds, as it is believed, were organised in Italy. In France, they were very common before Charlemagne, and are first mentioned in the Carolingian capitularies of 779 and 789. Commercial and craft guilds began to become common in France, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden in the 11th century. The oldest known ordinances, as the written laws for the government of a guild were called, occur in England in the 11th century. The guild principle proved so successful and was applied to so many uses that by the 12th and 13th centuries it became the outstanding feature of the social and economic life of Europe. One of the commonest early uses of that principle was in the frith, or peace guilds, which became very popular in North Europe in the 6th century. The Vikings organised then to suppress piracy, and in England the century later, where they were referred to in the laws of Ine. These were voluntary associations of men organised for mutual defence, to supplement defective laws, and to police the community in a period when national governments were not known and when the authority of the town was very weak. In the course of time, guilds multiplied until they came to be used for every conceivable purpose: for good fellowship, for drinking, for ensuring a decent burial, for worship, for hunting, travel, art, and for banking. Priests and friars organised, sailors, travellers, woodsmen and shepherds. There were guilds for men, women, children, for rich and for poor, in the country and in the town. Functions now performed by government armies, schools, stores, factories, hospitals, trade unions, and most of the other innumerable forms into which social organisation has differentiated itself, were then held in keeping by guilds. The typical guild had prayers for the dead, a common chest for incidental upkeep and the relief of the widows and orphans of deceased members, periodical meetings with banquets, admitted members on an oath, sometimes two, administered fines, adopted ordinances for the regulation of its own activities, punished members for improper conduct, and cooperated in many ways with the town or national governments. Most of these societies were small, the largest on record being the Corpus Christi Guild at York, which once boasted of 15,000 members. Sometimes many guilds in a community consolidated, but there was never a countrywide merger. Of the City of London, there is a record of one guild in 1130, of 18 in 1180, and of 110 in 1422. In the time of Edward III, there were listed more than 40,000 religious and trade guilds in England. The census of 1389 showed 909 in Norfolk alone. This proliferation received its first serious setback during the Reformation, when Henry VIII despoiled all religious guilds. It died down rapidly with the advent of the capitalist system and came to a dead stop, except in a few unimportant instances, in the last century. France prohibited them in 1789 to 91, Spain and Portugal in 1833 to 1840, Austria and Germany 1859 to 1860, Italy in 1864, Scotland, where the development had followed continental lines, in 1846, and England in 1835. In its heyday, the guild system was very closely connected with the Church, so closely that some writers credit the Church with its origin. Almost every guild had its patron saint, before whose image it kept a candle burning, and many set aside sums of money for the sustentation of a priest, the maintenance of a chapel, and for masses, chantries, church charities, and church schools. Oftentimes a guild had its own chaplain, and a very large number, as already noted, were devoted exclusively to religious purposes. These religious fraternities were suppressed in England in 1547, and other guilds were at the same time forbidden to give money to churches. A number of the Roman Catholic fraternities now existing are lineal descendants of the old religious guilds. Partly as a result of their allegiance with the Church, many guilds, otherwise devoted to purely secular pursuits, participated in pageants and in mystery, morality, and miracle plays, the forerunners of our modern drama. These plays were staged on wagons drawn in a procession from one exhibition point to another across the town, and always it was a day of excitement when they were shown, and vast crowds gathered. Expenses were divided among the guilds and parts allotted, as at Norwich, where the mercers, drapers, and haberdashers presented the creation of the world, the grocer's paradise, the smiths, the fight between David and Goliath, or, as at Hereford, the glovers gave Adam and Eve, the carpenters Noah's ship, the tailors the three kings, etc. It is of record that on a few instances parts were taken by guilds of masons. I am of the opinion that the drama of our third degree may very probably have been originally an old mystery play, which may have found its way to us through some masons' guild that participated in it. It used to be the fashion to say that the guild corporation and the town corporation were identical, or that the former gradually metamorphosed into the latter, a view given a very wide circulation by Brentano. This idea has been abandoned. There always was a close connection between the town government and guild government, but the two were always distinct, except possibly in 2 or 3 negligible instances. In many cases, a man had to be a guild member before he could become a citizen, but the guild ordinances were always subordinate to the town authority. The manner in which the guilds governed themselves will be described later. It is a remarkable fact, and one worthy of a special remark to us Masons, that many guilds accepted men not at all engaged in the craft, as patrons or as means of bestowing an honour or some special privilege. Indeed, writes one of the best authorities, E. Lipsum, the members of many London companies frequently came to have only a very faint connection with the business of the company to which they were attached. A fact that makes it easier for us to understand how non-operatives came to be admitted into the old Masonic guilds or lodges. They included in their membership, writes another authority, most of the wealthy men of the nation, and the great guild halls now standing in the City of London testify to the proud names with which they are so generously decorated, that the men who made England what she was, the men who built her commerce, won her wealth, and risked their lives and fortunes in extending England's commercial supremacy, were mighty in the guilds. Henry IV, Henry VI, and Henry VIII were guild members. So also Edward III, who belonged to a guild of armourers. There is therefore nothing extraordinary in the fact that Elias Ashmole and other worthies of his time sought membership among the operative Masons. The guild system in general had 2 grand periods of development, the first of which culminated in the merchant guilds, as were called those associations formed in all of the towns for the purpose of managing and controlling trading and commerce. Such a guild included all engaged in a given kind of commerce, including wage earners as well as proprietors, and the object was to enable the merchants to maintain a monopoly of, and an efficient organization of, all the merchandising in a given community. These organizations grew apace and waxed powerful and became, in time, the foster parents of English commerce. More than 100 towns in England and 70 in Ireland and Wales had them. They reached their zenith in the 12th century, began to disappear in the 14th century, and were almost completely superseded by craft guilds in the 15th century. Merchant guilds engaged in so many activities, some private, some public, that it is impossible to describe them in full. Among the most important of their functions was the control of import and export of wares, the limiting of the number permitted in any trade, the regulation of wages and prices, and the inspection and standardization of goods. Every member had to pay scot and lot, as the general taxes were called, and take oath to obey the rulers and ordinances, as well as contribute his annual dues. As a reward from his membership, he was privileged to share in business transactions and in bargains, and was given a status in the community very much coveted. If he fell ill, he was cared for. His family was looked after in case of his death. In unemployment, he was helped to find a position, and he was protected against quarrels and unjust dealings. The guild was governed by an alderman, or elder man, and his associates, 2 or 4 in number, had its own treasury, passed its own ordinances, could fine or otherwise punish its members, and, in some instances, had its own court. At periodical meetings, called morning speeches, the brethren passed or revised ordinances, admitted new members, feasted, and elected officers. As industry developed in scope and complexity, it became increasingly difficult for these guilds merchant to retain their monopolies. Gradually there grew up a new system to supersede the old, known as craft guilds, in which not commerce but a handicraft was the unit. There was a struggle between the new system and the old, but the old at last gave way and in the 15th century ceased to be. Craft guilds were not, as has often been alleged, the offspring of the merchant guilds, for there was no organic connection between them. They were, variously, 2 similar, but quite distinct and separate developments of the guild principle due to economic changes. The primary purpose of the craft guild was to establish a complete system of industrial control over all who were associated together in the pursuit of a common calling. The merchant guild, working usually in the smaller towns, organised a whole industry. The craft guilds, springing up everywhere, from London to almost every hamlet, organised each separate part of every industry or vocation as an independent entity. For example, where the merchant guild had organised the leather business as a whole, craft guilds broke it up into specialities, so that tanners, saddle makers, harness makers, bridle makers, shoe makers, slipper makers, boot makers, etc., each had their own fraternity. This high degree of specialization was extended to the arts, to social interests, amusements, and education. It was even extended to religion, so that in one church might be a guild of priests, of musicians, of singers, of actors in the mystery play, and a guild to look after the altar, besides, to see that it was properly dressed with rich cloths and its candles always burning. The guilds devoted wholly to some one handicraft performed an astonishing number of functions, and became a little family world to each member, in which he found his social fellowship, his school, his business, his hospital, his sick, health and life insurance, protection against enemies, employment bureau, a court to which to be responsible for his conduct, and laws and ordinances for controlling his conduct. The old debate among Masonic writers as to whether the medieval operative Masonic guilds possessed any speculative elements would seem to be singularly beside the point. Every guild was full of speculative elements, even the pig drivers and sheep herders, who, like the rest, had their patron saints, their religious festivals, and burned a candle at the altar. Many free grammar schools were founded and maintained by the guilds. Writes Lipsum in his excellent economic history, which formed one of the main sources of education in the Middle Ages, and one guild, that of Corpus Christi, Cambridge, perpetuated its memory by founding the famous college that still bears its name. In this way, the guilds contributed to the spread of learning, and the voluntary efforts of artisans helped keep burning the lamp of knowledge. He could have added many more examples. Dean Colet turned over to a guild the management of his St. Paul's School. William Shakespeare secured his Little Latin and Less Greek at a guild school in Stratford-on-Avon. Many writers have described craft guilds as the trade unions of the Middle Ages, but this is most inaccurate. As Sidney and Beatrice Webb have stated so clearly in their magnificent history of trade unions, there was no connection whatever between the two, and only a superficial resemblance. The Craft Guild was a quasi-public body, so often interwoven with municipal government that the learned writers have confused the two. It controlled trade not in the interests of workmen merely, but of all, the public included. Membership in it was compulsory, and so recognized by local and national laws. Its ranks included employers as well as the employed, and these two groups did not come into conflict until later, with the rise of journeymen's guilds. It accepted into membership only trained men, all others, servants, etc., being left outside and considered as cowans. It was a purely local institution, with a territory limited by the community boundaries, and in addition to the regulation of wages, hours, and general trade conditions, it was also engaged, as described above, in many activities of a purely social nature and unrelated to the trade itself. At the head of the typical guild were the wardens, 2 or 4, usually elected by the assembly but sometimes appointed by the mayor, holding office for 1 year, whose duty it was to supervise the work turned out by the craft and see that certain standards were maintained. The assembly usually met once a year, but sometimes 4 times and at stated intervals. The guild often had its own court, and members were admitted on oath. The general membership was divided into the 3 grades of masters, journeymen or fellow crafts, and apprentices. But any journeyman might become a master, so that, as far as skilled was concerned, there were only 2 classes. Women were admitted into many guilds and were permitted to take on apprentices and to hire journeymen. The most admirable feature of the whole guild system was the institution called Apprenticeship, which was a method for training youths in their vocation, never since surpassed and not often equalled. A boy was indentured or contracted to some master for a term of years, which in earlier times might last from 1 to 10 years, but in 1563 was everywhere in England fixed at 7 years. The master furnished bed and board, technical training, sometimes a small salary, sometimes schooling, supervised his conduct, and generally stood to the boy in loco parentis. The boy, in his turn, was obliged to be no bondsman, of good physique, a faithful workman, and alive to his master's welfare. The beginnings of this system have been traced to 1260. It became a vital part of the whole economic system in the 13th century. Apprentices were usually registered with the town authorities and otherwise given a recognized status in the community. The terms and experiences of his position passed into popular speech, remaining in use until the present day, coloured all social thinking, and often was celebrated in literature, as in Goethe's William Meister. The apprentice custom, as the reader will have already discerned, remains embedded in our own Masonic system to remind us that a candidate for our mystery stands as much in need of training as the youth of old times who knocked at the door of a guild. If our statesmen and rulers ever come to understand Masonry as they should, and its possibilities in the world, the reconstitution of the apprentice system in our fraternity and a more thorough and intelligent use of it will be one of their first concerns. To expect a man to be able to understand or practice Freemasonry without adequate preparation is as ridiculous now as it was when Masonic guilds were devoted to architecture and the building crafts. We are not called on to raise fabrics of wood and stone into the sky, but ours is an even more difficult task, for it is our duty to build manhood and to reorganize the whole world into the forms of brotherhood. Surely a high calling and demanding skilled workman. The time of his indenture completed, the apprentice graduated into the ranks of the journeyman, becoming thereby a fellow of the craft, i.e., entitled to its liberties and privileges on equal terms with all others. This passing to higher grade was signalized by some proof of his skill, a masterpiece, in many cases, or an examination before the wardens. Incidentally, wardens were now known as deacons in Scotland, whence some of our Masonic nomenclature was derived. In Europe, the young journeyman went out to wander to Ur, in order to see something of the world and of the practices of his craft in other places. But this custom never secured a foothold in England. Usually, in some cases compulsorily, a journeyman, sometimes called a yeoman, young man, hired himself out to some master for 2 or 3 years at wages, and then, with a little money of his own, set up his own shop, hired journeymen, indentured apprentices, and became a master. In the course of time, the masters, being the moneyed class, tended to arrogate to themselves more and more power, and to adopt legislation in their own interests, and the journeymen, as their numbers increased, learned to combine to secure their own interests, especially after a permanently wage-earning class was developed. Upon this, journeymen began to form guilds of their own, often in despite of the authorities, a thing that became quite common by the 15th century. On the continent, especially in the industrial centres and in Germany, this conflict between masters and men often broke out into pitched battles with much shedding of blood. The Medici family emerged from such a welter to the control of Florence. But in England, the struggle was more quiet. By the 17th century, journeyman guilds were quite subdued and content to remain subordinate to the masters, who grew more and more oligarchical. In many of the large cities, the masters secured all control in their own hands, and gradually, with the coming of modern capitalism and manufacturing, and the rise of nationalism, the whole guild system broke up and quietly passed away. Some of the craft societies still survived so late as the latter half of the 18th century, but their privileges were formally and finally abolished by Parliament in 1835. The study of the medieval Masonic guilds from which Freemasonry evolved, or at least with which it has at least a certain amount of historical continuity, must be reserved for another time, as demanding more space and time than is here available. In the present connection, it is not necessary to call a Masonic reader's attention to the fact that whatever historical connection may have been, and to what extent our modern craft is indebted to the old guild system, Freemasonry was in the beginning of a piece with that system, and inherited many things from it, so that it is quite impossible to understand our fraternity today apart from the craft guilds of old, in which apprentices, fellow crafts, and masters, united in the one hand, toiled and lived together in brotherhood to the end that the word might be served, and themselves enabled to earn masters' wages and to perfect themselves in their mystery. For a deep dive into the history, philosophy, and traditions of Freemasonry, subscribe to From the Quarries. You will find hundreds of lectures, presentations, shorts, and other Masonic works written by Freemasons for Freemasons. Visit FromTheQuarries.com or YouTube at From the Quarries.